David Chen was elbow-deep in a malfunctioning atmospheric recycler when the knock came at his door. Soft, but insistent in the way that suggested someone who needed help, but was too polite to demand it. He pulled his head out of the maintenance panel, wiping grease off his hands with a rag that had seen better decades, and glanced at the chronometer on his wall. 23:47 ship time, which meant he'd been working for exactly 18 hours and 13 minutes straight. "This better not be another emergency," he muttered, making his way to the door of his cramped quarters aboard the massive truce barge Sanctuary's Hope. The ship housed nearly 200,000 war refugees, and something was always breaking down, backing up, or catching fire in ways that defied both physics and common sense. The door slid open to reveal a young woman standing in the corridor, with the kind of formal posture that suggested either military training or extreme nervousness. Her silver-blue hair caught the corridor's emergency lighting, and her ears were elegantly pointed in the distinctive fashion of the Seraphim nobility, though her simple refugee clothing marked her as just another displaced person fleeing the ongoing war. "May I sleep beside you tonight, human?" she said without preamble, her accent carrying the musical quality that made Seraphim language sound like poetry, even when discussing mundane topics. David blinked, certain he'd misheard something crucial in the translation. "I'm sorry, what?" "The night vigil," she clarified, though her explanation didn't actually clarify anything. "I invoke the ancient custom of sanctuary until dawn." David looked down the empty corridor, then back at the woman who was apparently propositioning him in the most polite and formal way possible. "Look," he said carefully, "I think there might be some kind of translation error here. I'm just a maintenance technician. I fix life support systems and unclog recycling units. I don't. Whatever this is about." The woman's expression remained calmly determined. "I am Lyra Vostai of the Seraphim High Council, and I formally request night vigil sanctuary according to the ancient codes. Will you grant or deny?" "That's definitely not in the Refugee Assistance Manual," David said, running his free hand through his hair while trying to process what was happening. "Night vigil sanctuary. Is that some kind of? I mean, are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I am requesting protection until sunrise according to Seraphim law," Lyra replied. "The vigil keeper provides sanctuary to one in mortal danger. No romantic implications are intended or required." David felt something relax in his chest that he hadn't realized was tense. Oh, that's okay, that makes more sense. You're in danger, and you need somewhere safe to stay until morning." "Precisely." He stepped back from the doorway, gesturing for her to enter. "Well, I can't exactly turn away someone asking for help. Though I have to warn you, the accommodations are pretty basic. One bunk, one chair, and a lot of technical manuals scattered around." Lyra entered his quarters with fluid grace, taking in the cramped space with the kind of careful assessment that suggested she was used to much better accommodations, but had learned to make do. She settled onto the floor beside his bunk with the dignity of someone who could make sleeping on bare metal look like a conscious lifestyle choice. "So," David said, closing the door and trying to figure out the social protocols for this situation. "Mortal danger. That sounds serious. Want to talk about it?" "My family's evacuation convoy was attacked 3 days ago," Lyra said simply. "Pirates, according to the official reports, though pirates using advanced human military weaponry seems unlikely." David sat down on his bunk, noting the way she'd phrased that last part. "You think it wasn't pirates?" "I think someone wanted to ensure that certain members of the Seraphim Evacuation Authority didn't reach their destination." "And you're part of this evacuation authority?" Lyra was quiet for a moment, her pointed ears twitching slightly in what David was learning to interpret as careful consideration. "I was. My family held hereditary positions on the High Council responsible for authorizing refugee corridor access. I appear to be the only survivor." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Someone's been systematically eliminating your family." That would be my assessment, yes. Around them, the ship's bulkheads hummed with the subtle vibrations of a vessel, carrying far too many people through space that wasn't entirely safe for anyone. David had spent 3 years aboard refugee barges, and he'd learned to recognize the sounds that meant everything was functioning normally versus the sounds that meant he needed to grab his emergency kit and run toward whatever was breaking down. Currently, everything sounded normal, which somehow made Lyra's presence in his quarters feel even more surreal. "The night vigil," he said. "How exactly does that work?" "The vigil keeper agrees to provide sanctuary until sunrise. In return, the one seeking sanctuary is bound by honor to speak truthfully and cause no harm to the keeper or their household. And it's legally binding." "Under Seraphim law, yes. And according to the Refugee Protection Accords, customs of displaced peoples are to be respected and upheld by sanctuary vessels." David looked around his tiny quarters, which definitely didn't qualify as a household by any reasonable definition. "So basically, you've just made my maintenance closet into a legally protected sanctuary." "That is correct." Something chimed softly from the walls, and David glanced at the environmental displays that monitored everything from air quality to structural integrity. New readings were appearing that he'd never seen before, biosignature patterns and proximity sensors that shouldn't have been active in crew quarters. "Huh," he said. "That's new." Lyra followed his gaze to the displays, and her expression shifted to something that might have been concern. "The ship is recording our interaction." "Recording it how?" "Biosignature, proximity readings, duration of contact." She paused, her ears doing that twitching thing again. "Under certain interpretations of interstellar law, this could constitute formal witness bond protocols." "Witness bond protocols," David repeated slowly, "as in marriage." "As in legal partnership with shared authority over certain restricted functions." David stared at the readings on his wall display, watching numbers and patterns that apparently meant his routine act of helping a refugee had just entangled him in alien legal customs that were way above his pay grade. "You know," he said finally, "when I took this job, they said it would involve fixing broken things and helping people. They didn't mention anything about accidentally getting legally bound to alien nobility through ancient sanctuary customs." "I apologize for the complication," Lyra said softly. "I had hoped the night vigil would provide simple protection without triggering broader legal implications. And now we appear to have until sunrise to determine whether the implications are beneficial or catastrophic." David looked at the environmental readings, at the elegant alien woman sitting with perfect composure on his floor, and at the technical manuals scattered around his quarters that definitely hadn't prepared him for any of this. "Well," he said, "I always said I wanted more excitement in my job. I guess the universe decided to take me literally." The knock at David's door came at exactly 0600 ship time, which he knew because he'd been staring at the chronometer for the past hour, while trying not to think about the fact that he'd apparently spent the night in some kind of alien legal ceremony. Lyra had remained seated on his floor with the patience of someone accustomed to formal vigils, occasionally answering his questions about Seraphim customs, while the ship's bioscanners continued recording readings that probably meant something important to someone. "That'll be Dr. Martinez," David said, recognizing the authoritative knock of the barge's chief medical officer. "She does morning rounds on crew quarters when the overnight readings show anything unusual." "Unusual how?" Lyra asked, rising to her feet with the same fluid grace she displayed the night before. "Let's find out." David opened the door to reveal Dr. Sarah Martinez holding a data pad and wearing the expression she reserved for situations that were either medically fascinating or personally inconvenient. Her dark eyes took in Lyra's presence with the kind of professional assessment that missed nothing important and cataloged everything potentially relevant. "David," she said without preamble, "according to the ship's biomonitoring systems, You've been in close proximity to another person for the past 7 hours. Since you're not exactly known for your active social life, I thought I should check whether this represents a medical emergency or a personal development. It's complicated, David replied, which was becoming his standard response to questions about his life. Dr. Martinez consulted her data pad, her expression growing more intrigued. The readings show sustained biosynchronization, shared atmospheric exchange, and what the system is classifying as formal proximity bonding. David, these are the kind of readings we typically see during interspecies diplomatic marriage ceremonies. We're not married, David said quickly. Actually, Lyra interjected softly, under certain interpretations of interstellar law we might be. Dr. Martinez raised an eyebrow that had achieved legendary status throughout the refugee fleet for its ability to convey volumes of information without requiring actual words. And you didn't think to mention this during the night vigil. I had hoped the ship systems wouldn't interpret proximity sanctuary as formal bonding protocols, Lyra admitted. It appears I underestimated the sophistication of human biomonitoring technology. David sat down heavily on his bunk, staring at the readings on his wall display that were apparently documenting his accidental marriage to alien nobility. So let me get this straight, he said. I offered someone a safe place to sleep, and the ship's computer decided that constituted a wedding ceremony. The legal implications are more complex than simple marriage, Lyra explained. The consort witness bond grants shared authority over certain restricted functions, in this case, potentially including access to quarantined evacuation corridors. Dr. Martinez looked up from her data pad with the kind of sharp attention that meant she just realized something significant. Quarantined evacuation corridors, as in the sealed hyperspace routes that could safely transport millions of refugees currently trapped in contested systems. Among other things, yes. And this bond gives you both access to those systems. It grants us joint authority to authorize emergency evacuation protocols that bypass standard governmental approval processes. David felt something cold settle in his stomach as the implications became clear. Which means someone might have a very good reason to want us dead before we can use that authority. Dr. Martinez was already activating her emergency communication device. Commander Torres needs to hear about this immediately. Within minutes, the cramped quarters were occupied by Commander Rebecca Torres, the barge's security chief, whose presence always made small spaces feel even smaller. She listened to Lyra's explanation with the kind of professional attention that cataloged potential threats and defensive options simultaneously. Long-range sensors detected 3 unidentified vessels moving to intercept our position, Commander Torres reported. Their energy signatures don't match any known refugee convoy configurations, but they're definitely carrying military-grade weaponry. How long until they reach us? David asked, though he was fairly certain he didn't want to know the answer. 4 hours, maybe 5. Lyra moved to David's environmental displays, manipulating the interface with the kind of familiarity that suggested extensive training in ship systems. If we can access the quarantined corridors, we could evacuate the contested refugee populations before the military contractors realize what's happening. Military contractors? Dr. Martinez asked. The same people who profit from refugee crises by selling protection services and supply contracts, Lyra explained grimly. Independent evacuation routes would eliminate their market. Commander Torres checked her tactical display, her expression growing more serious. The approaching vessels are maintaining communication silence and refusing to respond to standard identification queries. That's consistent with mercenary operations. David looked around his quarters at the 3 women who were discussing his accidental marriage in terms of military strategy and refugee salvation. So basically, he said, I offered someone a place to sleep, accidentally triggered an ancient alien legal ceremony, gained the authority to save millions of lives, and painted a target on our backs for people who profit from human suffering. That is substantially accurate, Lyra confirmed. And now we have 4 hours to decide whether to formalize this bond and open the evacuation corridors, knowing that doing so will definitely make us targets for assassination. Or we break the bond and watch millions of refugees remain trapped in war zones, while military contractors profit from their desperation. David stood up, looking at the bio readings that documented his night vigil with an alien noblewoman who'd asked politely if she could sleep on his floor. "You know what?" he said. 3 years ago, I took this job because I wanted to help people. I figured that meant fixing air recyclers and maintaining food systems. And now, Dr. Martinez asked, now I'm starting to think that sometimes helping people means accepting responsibilities you never planned for. He looked at Lyra, whose pointed ears were doing that twitching thing that he was learning to interpret as cautious hope. The night vigil ends at sunrise, right? Traditionally, yes. And after that, we either formalize the consort witness bond or we don't. Correct. David checked the chronometer, noting that they had exactly 3 hours and 47 minutes until artificial dawn. "Well," he said, "I've been accidentally married by a spaceship's computer system. I guess the next logical step is figuring out whether that marriage can save a few million people from dying in a war they didn't start." Commander Torres was already activating her communication systems. "I'll need to brief the senior staff and prepare defensive positions. If we're going to do this, we'll need to be ready for whatever those unidentified vessels are planning. And I'll need to review the medical implications of interspecies legal bonding," Dr. Martinez added, "just in case there are biological compatibility issues we need to address." As they filed out of his quarters to begin preparations, David found himself alone with Lyra for the first time since the night vigil had begun. "So," he said, "any second thoughts about asking to sleep on the floor of a maintenance technician's quarters?" Lyra's smile was the first genuinely relaxed expression he'd seen from her. "Actually," she said, "I'm beginning to think the universe has a better sense of timing than either of us initially suspected." The first plasma torpedo struck the sanctuary's hope exactly 2 hours and 37 minutes before artificial dawn, which David knew because he'd been obsessively checking the chronometer while reviewing evacuation protocols that he'd never expected to have the authority to implement. The impact sent vibrations through the massive barge's superstructure, and emergency klaxons began wailing throughout the ship's vast corridors. "So much for 4 hours, David muttered, grabbing his emergency toolkit while Lyra moved to his quarters communication panel with the kind of efficient urgency that suggested this wasn't her first experience with ship-to-ship combat. "The attacking vessels are targeting specific sections," she reported, manipulating the display with practiced skill. "Not random bombardment, but precision strikes aimed at disabling rather than destroying." "They want us alive," David realized. "Or at least they want the ship intact enough to board and capture us." Another impact shook the barge, and David's environmental systems began displaying damage reports from throughout the ship. Hull breaches in sections 7 and 12, power fluctuations in the primary reactor housing, and what looked like communications jamming across most of the long-range arrays. "This is Commander Torres," came the announcement over the ship's internal communication system. "All crew to emergency stations. We are under attack by unidentified hostile forces. This is not a drill." David activated his emergency comlink. "Commander, this is Chen in Maintenance Section 4. I'm reading power fluctuations that could cascade into life support failures if we don't stabilize the reactor housing." "Negative, Chen. You and the Seraphim woman are to report to the Central Assembly Hall immediately. We need to keep you both in a secure location." The Central Assembly Hall. David looked at Lyra, who was checking readings on her own portable device. That's where we'd hold the formal ratification ceremony. Which means Commander Torres is betting that our best defense is to complete the consort witness bond and activate the evacuation protocols before the attackers can stop us. A third impact rocked the ship, this one close enough to David's quarters that the lights flickered, and his environmental displays showed microfractures appearing in the bulkhead structures. Through his small viewport, he could see the running lights of the attacking vessels as they closed in for what was obviously a boarding operation. The corridors between here and the assembly hall are going to be chaos, he said, pulling on his emergency gear while trying not to think about the fact that he was about to traverse a ship under attack with an alien noblewoman who apparently represented the key to saving millions of lives. I should mention, Lyra said as they prepared to leave his quarters, that my training included certain defensive skills that weren't typically part of noble education. Defensive skills meaning what exactly? Instead of answering, she produced a compact energy weapon from somewhere in her refugee clothing and checked its charge with the kind of professional competence that suggested extensive familiarity with military hardware. Right, David said. I'm getting married and immediately facing a home invasion. This is definitely not how I imagined my life would go. They left his quarters and immediately encountered chaos. Emergency lighting bathed the corridors in ominous red, while refugees streamed toward designated safe zones, their voices creating a multilingual chorus of fear and confusion. David led the way toward the central assembly hall, following routes he knew by heart from 3 years of maintaining systems throughout the massive ship. There, Lyra said, pointing toward a section junction where armored figures were setting up what looked like military-grade scanning equipment. Those aren't ship security. David studied the figures, noting their coordinated movements and advanced gear. Boarding party. They're setting up to track our biosignatures, which means they know exactly who they're looking for. They detoured through the ship's vast hydroponic gardens, where food was grown for the 200,000 refugees under artificial sunlight and carefully controlled atmospheric conditions. The gardens provided cover and multiple routes, but they also contained evidence that made David's blood run cold. "Look at this," he said, pointing to communication equipment hidden among the food plants. "This isn't standard agricultural monitoring." Lyra examined the devices with growing alarm. These are military-grade transmission arrays. Someone's been broadcasting detailed intelligence about the ship's operations and passenger manifest. Someone on the inside. Someone with access to secure areas and the authority to install covert equipment without raising suspicions. The implications hit David like a physical blow. The attackers aren't just hunting us randomly. They've been tracking our movements, probably since the night vigil began. Energy weapons fire echoed through the gardens as the boarding parties began their systematic search. David and Lyra moved deeper into the agricultural sections, weaving between food plants from a dozen different worlds, while trying to reach the assembly hall through routes that wouldn't be covered by the internal surveillance network. "David," Lyra said as they crouched behind a cluster of Terran wheat plants, "I need to tell you something about the night vigil. Now seems like a great time for revelations. The custom isn't random. It's typically invoked when someone knows that specific legal authorities are needed for emergency situations." David felt something cold settling in his chest. "You're saying someone knew this would happen?" "I'm saying someone arranged for me to be in a position where I would need to invoke sanctuary, knowing that it would trigger the consort witness protocols and grant us access to the evacuation corridors. Someone set us up. Or someone is using us to accomplish something that requires both human and seraphim legal authority." More weapons fire, closer now, and David could hear the distinctive sound of military boots on metal decking. The boarding parties were conducting a thorough search, and it was only a matter of time before they reached the gardens. "The assembly hall," David said. "If we can reach it and complete the formal ratification, We can activate the evacuation protocols and broadcast what we've learned about the conspiracy. And if we can't reach it? David looked at the covert communication equipment, thought about the systematic attacks on Lyra's family, and considered the military contractors who profited from keeping refugees trapped in war zones. Then millions of people stay trapped, and whoever's behind this conspiracy continues profiting from human suffering while we either get killed or captured. Lyra checked her weapon again, her pointed ears twitching in what David had learned to recognize as determination. The night vigil ends at sunrise whether we're in the assembly hall or not, but the formal ratification has to be witnessed to be legally binding. So we need an audience. We need the refugees to witness the ceremony, which legitimizes our authority to open the evacuation corridors. David checked his chronometer, 1 hour and 43 minutes until artificial dawn. Around them, the sounds of the search were growing closer, while throughout the ship, 200,000 refugees waited in designated safe zones, unaware that their salvation might depend on a maintenance technician and an alien noblewoman completing a marriage ceremony under fire. "You know what?" David said, grabbing Lyra's hand as they prepared to make a run for the assembly hall. 3 years ago, I wanted a job where I could help people. I guess the universe decided to give me exactly what I asked for. The central assembly hall of the sanctuary's Hope had been designed to hold 10,000 people for emergency announcements and cultural gatherings. When David and Lyra arrived, breathless from their run through combat zones and maintenance corridors, it contained nearly 50,000 refugees from dozens of different species, all crowded together while their temporary home shook under weapons fire from attacking vessels. "Well," David said, looking out at the sea of faces representing the displaced populations of half a dozen star systems, "we definitely have an audience." The ship's main display screens showed the approaching artificial dawn, now less than 20 minutes away, while tactical overlays indicated that the boarding parties had reached the assembly hall's outer perimeters. Commander Torres stood at the security station, coordinating defensive positions while Dr. Martinez operated mobile medical units for the wounded. "David," Commander Torres called out, "whatever you're planning to do, now would be a good time." Lyra moved to the hall's central platform, her presence immediately commanding attention from the assembled refugees. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the space without amplification, rich with the formal authority of seraphim nobility. "I am Lyra Vosti of the High Council," she announced, "and I invoke the completion of the night vigil bond with David Chen of Earth, witnessed by this assembly under the ancient codes and the Refugee Protection Accords." A murmur passed through the crowd as translation systems processed her words into dozens of languages. David joined her on the platform, feeling profoundly out of place in his maintenance coveralls, while surrounded by refugees who were about to witness what might be the most important ceremony in galactic history. "So," he said to the assembly, his voice carrying the kind of nervous humor that had gotten him through 3 years of impossible repair jobs, "I'm about to get married during a space battle to someone I met 12 hours ago, in order to gain legal authority to save millions of lives. This is either the most romantic thing ever or the most terrifying, and I'm honestly not sure which." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and David realized that sometimes humor was exactly what desperate people needed to hear. The ceremony itself was surprisingly simple. Lyra spoke formal phrases in seraphim, while the ship's systems recorded their biosignatures and proximity readings. David responded with equally formal human marriage vows that Dr. Martinez had quickly downloaded from the legal databases. Around them, 50,000 refugees served as witnesses, while weapons fire echoed through the ship's corridors. "By the ancient codes of sanctuary and the laws of interstellar cooperation," Lyra concluded, "I bind myself as consort witness to David Chen, with shared authority over all emergency protocols and evacuation procedures." The moment David spoke his acceptance, Every display screen in the assembly hall lit up with new information. Quarantined evacuation corridors that had been sealed for months suddenly showed as accessible. Emergency protocols that required dual-species authorization became active. And most importantly, quantum communication arrays began broadcasting evidence of the war profiteering conspiracy to neutral governments and media outlets throughout known space. "Wow," David said, watching data streams flow across the displays. "That's actually kind of beautiful in a universe-changing sort of way." The evidence was damning and comprehensive. Military contractors had been deliberately prolonging refugee crises by sabotaging independent evacuation efforts while selling expensive protection services to desperate civilian populations. The systematic elimination of evacuation authorities like Lyra's family had been coordinated by corporations whose profits depended on maintaining the crisis indefinitely. "The evacuation corridors are now active," Commander Torres reported. "We have authorization to begin emergency refugee transport to neutral space." And the attacking vessels, breaking off their assault. Apparently, they've received new orders from higher authority. Through the assembly hall's viewports, David could see the attacking vessels retreating from their position, while new ships arrived. Neutral peacekeeping forces responding to the broadcast evidence of war crimes. The conspiracy that had operated in shadow for years was being exposed to galactic scrutiny in real time. "So," David said to Lyra as chaos transformed into coordinated evacuation efforts around them, "how do you feel about being married to a maintenance technician who accidentally became a key figure in interstellar law?" "I think," she replied, her pointed ears twitching in what he'd learned to recognize as contentment, "that the universe has excellent timing when it comes to putting the right people in the right place at the right moment. Even when those people have no idea what they're doing. Especially then." Dr. Martinez approached the platform with a medical scanner and the expression she reserved for situations that were medically fascinating. "The biobonding appears to be stable," she announced. "No adverse physiological effects from interspecies legal marriage, though I should note that you're both now legally responsible for the largest refugee evacuation in galactic history." Around them, the assembly hall had transformed into a coordination center, as refugees organized themselves into evacuation groups, while transport vessels began arriving through the newly opened corridors. David watched 50,000 people preparing to finally escape the war zones they'd been trapped in for months or years, and felt something profound settle in his chest. "You know," he said to Lyra, 12 hours ago I was a guy who fixed air recyclers and complained about boring maintenance schedules. And now I'm apparently married to alien nobility and jointly responsible for rewriting interstellar refugee law." He gestured at the evacuation efforts spreading throughout the ship. "This is either the best career change ever or I'm having the most elaborate stress-induced hallucination in medical history." "The evacuation corridors are processing transport requests faster than we anticipated," Commander Torres reported. "We should be able to clear all contested refugee populations within 72 hours. 72 hours, David repeated. 3 days to evacuate millions of people who have been trapped for years. The power of proper legal authority," Lyra said with a smile that suggested she was enjoying the irony of bureaucracy actually working for once, "and the benefits of having a husband who understands complex mechanical systems." "Husband," David said, testing the word. "I'm still getting used to that." Through the assembly hall's main displays, they could see the results of their quantum broadcast spreading across the galaxy. Military contractors were facing immediate investigation by multiple governments. War profiteering networks were being dismantled in real time. Corporate executives who had built fortunes on prolonging refugee crises were being arrested by neutral peacekeeping forces. "The conspiracy is unraveling faster than anyone expected," Dr. Martinez observed. Apparently, there were a lot of people waiting for evidence like this to surface. People who wanted to help but couldn't act without legal authority, Lyra added. The consort witness bond didn't just give us access to evacuation protocols. It provided the legitimacy that neutral governments needed to intervene. David looked around the assembly hall at refugees from dozens of species preparing to finally go home, at his friends and colleagues, coordinating the largest humanitarian operation in recent history, and at the alien woman whose request for sanctuary had transformed his life in ways he was still processing. "So what happens now?" he asked, "after the evacuations are complete and the war crimes tribunals finish their work?" "Now we figure out how to be married to each other while jointly administering interstellar refugee protection protocols," Lyra replied. "Though I should warn you, the position involves significantly more paperwork than maintenance work." "Paperwork," David said. "You know, after getting accidentally married during a space battle to expose galactic conspiracy theories, paperwork sounds almost relaxing." Commander Torres approached their platform with a communication device and an expression that suggested either very good news or very complicated news. "David, Lyra, I'm getting reports from refugee centers throughout the contested zones. The evacuation corridors are working beyond all expectations. We're processing transport requests from populations that have been trapped for years." "Any problems?" "Only the problem of success. We're going to need to expand the operation significantly to handle the volume of people who want to use these corridors." David looked at Lyra, who was already pulling up administrative displays on her portable device. "Expanded operations," he said. "More legal authority, more responsibility, more refugees to help." "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked. David thought about his old life of routine maintenance and predictable schedules, then looked at the evacuation efforts spreading throughout the galaxy as a direct result of his decision to offer sanctuary to someone who needed help. "You know what?" he said. "I always said I wanted to make a difference in the universe. I just figured it would involve fixing more complex machinery, not accidentally becoming a key figure in interstellar humanitarian law." "And how do you feel about the change?" David watched another transport vessel arrive to carry refugees to safety, its holds filled with families who would finally be able to stop running from a war they'd never wanted to fight. He thought about Lyra's request for sanctuary, about the night vigil that had changed both their lives, and about the fact that sometimes the most important moments in history began with simple human kindness. "I feel like," he said finally, "for the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing." Lyra's smile was radiant, her pointed ears twitching with what David had learned to recognize as deep satisfaction. "Even if it means being married to an alien who asked to sleep on your floor. Especially because it means being